Welcome. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because a lot of work went into uncovering the real events behind this legend. This is the true tale of a boy born into slavery who defied impossible odds, escaped the chains of oppression, and rose to become one of the deadliest gunslingers in Texas history. A story of survival, skill, and relentless determination. He was born into a world where every moment was a test of endurance. A place where the very air seemed to weigh down on the lungs of those who had no freedom to breathe. From the moment he opened his eyes on the plantation, life offered him little but hardship. His earliest memories were filled with the relentless sounds of labor, the crack of the overseer's whip, the stamping of horses in the stables, the rhythmic thud of cotton being hauled in baskets heavier than his small arms could carry. Each day began before dawn and ended long after the sun had disappeared behind the horizon. Sleep was never complete. It was stolen in short, shallow bursts, always with one ear alert, always listening for signs of danger or punishment. Even as a child, he learned to measure the distance between him and authority. Every glance, every whisper, every slight movement had consequences. He became acutely aware of the harsh hierarchy on the plantation, where an angry word or misstep could lead to pain or worse. Yet amid the brutality, he also learned observation, memory, and patience, skills that would later become vital for his survival. He watched the adults around him, how they moved silently at night, how they hid moments of defiance, and how small acts of cunning could save a life. These lessons were unspoken but etched into his mind with the sharpness of survival. Food was scarce, and what little he received was often barely enough to sustain him. Hunger became a constant companion, teaching him resourcefulness from a very young age. He learned which plants could be eaten raw, which berries could be trusted, and which insects, though small, were packed with sustenance. Every meal required strategy, every morsel earned through stealth or negotiation with those who shared his plight. It was a harsh education in self-reliance, forced upon him not by choice, but by necessity. The cruelty of the overseers was matched only by the cold efficiency of the plantation's routines. Yet within that oppressive environment, he discovered his first sparks of defiance. Small acts at first, stealing a piece of bread, hiding tools, slipping away to watch the world beyond the fences. These moments, fleeting as they were, brought a taste of freedom that would ignite a fire within him. He realized that the chains on his body were only one form of captivity. The chains on the mind, the constant watch, the fear, they were equally binding, and they could be challenged with cleverness and caution. But it was more than survival that shaped him. The boy quickly understood the value of strength, both physical and mental. He trained his body in secret, carrying heavy loads when no one was looking, running along the edges of the fields, testing his endurance. He observed the men who worked the stables and the fields, learning how they handled ropes, tools, and, most importantly, weapons. Firearms were rare, but when he caught glimpses of them, a musket leaning in the corner of a cabin, the sharp click of a pistol being cleaned, he studied their mechanics with curiosity that bordered on obsession. Even at a young age, he grasped the connection between skill and survival. The boy also began to recognize the power of fear. Not the fear he felt himself, but the fear he could invoke in others. He noticed the subtle ways the enslaved workers would protect themselves, the way their eyes darted to the whip, the way their bodies tensed at the slightest threat. This awareness planted in him a profound understanding survival wasn't only about hiding from danger. It was about anticipating it, manipulating it, and turning it to your advantage. By the time he reached his early teens, the boy had transformed from a frightened child into someone calculating, observant, and quietly strong. Every scar, every hunger pang, every harsh word had honed him. He had learned the value of patience, the necessity of cunning, and the importance of reading people. Knowledge far more dangerous than any weapon, yet equally powerful. He could move silently across the plantation, remain unseen, and survive where others faltered. It was this early life of deprivation, observation, and cunning that laid the foundation for his later legend. The brutality of slavery, which sought to break him, instead made him resilient, strategic, and aware of every weakness in those around him. The hardships he endured taught him lessons that no school could offer, lessons that would one day allow him to escape the chains of bondage and rise to a position that would terrify even the most dangerous men in Texas. In every sense, the enslaved boy's early life was not just a story of suffering. It was the forging of a mind and body that would become unstoppable. The night he finally ran was the first time he felt the raw, unfiltered taste of freedom. But it was also the night he truly understood the danger of the world beyond the plantation. By the time he reached his early teens, he had spent years observing every routine, memorizing every guard post, every fence line, and every habit of those who claimed to own him. Escape wasn't a sudden decision. It was a plan honed over months of careful observation. He knew that one misstep could cost him his life. Yet he also understood that staying meant certain suffering and a future of chains. He waited for the perfect night. The sky was moonless, the air heavy with humidity, and the scent of wildflowers that grew beyond the fields. The sounds of the plantation, the occasional creak of a gate, the low murmur of an overseer's voice, were familiar to him, yet that night they seemed amplified, a constant reminder that the slightest noise could betray him. He had prepared carefully a small bundle of stolen bread, a few coins taken from a careless pocket, and a small knife hidden in the folds of his shirt. Every item had a purpose. Every step had to be precise. When the overseers fell asleep or turned their attention elsewhere, he moved like a shadow. His small frame allowed him to slip unnoticed between the trees and the fence posts, avoiding the torch's beams. The dogs, trained to track runaway slaves, barked in the distance, but he had already anticipated their patrols and chosen a route through the creek beds, where the scent would be masked by flowing water. Each leap over roots and logs, each cautious step through thick brush, was a test of nerves and skill. He ran not just with fear driving him, but with a fierce determination to survive, to reach a world he had only glimpsed in stolen stories from older slaves and whispered tales of freedom beyond the plantation walls. The journey itself was a trial by fire. Nights were cold and treacherous, days were scorching, and the terrain was unfamiliar. He had to cross rivers, navigate dense forests, and avoid towns where bounty hunters and slave catchers roamed. Each encounter brought its own risks. A stray rider passing down a dusty road, a settler's dog barking in the distance, even the unpredictable dangers of the wild, snakes, panthers, and alligators that lurked in the southern swamps. Yet every danger only sharpened his instincts. He learned to move silently, to read the signs in the earth, to hide in plain sight. Hunger became a constant companion, and yet he scavenged, foraged, and sometimes risked dangerous raids on farms or campsites to keep himself alive. Along the way, he also discovered the power of human observation and manipulation. He learned to watch the movements of strangers, to read expressions, and to anticipate reactions. It wasn't enough to run. He had to survive encounters with men who might see him and attempt to capture him. Sometimes he would feign ignorance or act as if he belonged, blending into laboring groups or hitching temporary rides with travelers who never suspected the boy carried the weight of escape and vengeance in his eyes. Every trick he learned on the plantation, observation, patience, and deception became a weapon as sharp as any blade. The frontier itself became both a sanctuary and a teacher. In the Texas wilderness, he discovered freedom, but also a lawless world where skill with weapons, speed, and intelligence determined survival. He observed gunfights from a distance, studied how men handled pistols, rifles, and revolvers, and tested his own accuracy with makeshift targets. Every day honed his reflexes, every encounter with danger sharpened his instincts, and every night of sleep under the stars cemented his understanding that freedom required vigilance at all times. He could no longer rely on hidden fences or sympathetic neighbors. Survival demanded total mastery over himself and over any situation he might face. The escape also brought a sense of transformation. The boy who had been small, quiet, and observant on the plantation began to evolve into someone capable of commanding attention and respect. He learned that intimidation could be as powerful as skill. That silence and calculated observation could give him the upper hand against men much stronger and older. He had been forged in the cruelty of slavery, but now he was shaping himself into a figure that no one could control, a force of his own making. By the time he reached a safe settlement miles away from his old life, he was no longer just an escaped slave. He had become a survivor of the most extreme odds, a young man whose mind and body were finely tuned instruments of cunning, precision, and strength. He had faced every danger imaginable, nature, humans, and even the limits of his own body, and had come out alive. And in that crucible of escape, he had begun to lay the foundation for the legend that would follow him across Texas. A boy born into chains who had transformed himself into the deadliest gunslinger the frontier had ever seen. Once he was far from the plantation, beyond the reach of overseers and the ever-watchful eyes of bounty hunters, the boy discovered a world that would test every skill he had developed in secret. The Texas frontier was a land of endless opportunity, but also endless danger. It was here, among the dust-choked roads, the wide, open plains, and the settlements built on sheer grit, that he first realized the true value of firearms. On the plantation, he had only observed guns in passing, hidden in corners or handled by men he dared not confront. Now, in freedom, he had to master them himself if he hoped to survive. He started small, scavenging old pistols, rifles, and flintlocks from abandoned camps and settlements. At first, he had no mentor, no teacher. Only the mechanical understanding he had gleaned from years of observation. He studied the weight of the weapons, the way the hammer cocked, the way the trigger responded to pressure. He learned to clean them meticulously, understanding that a misfire could mean death. Every gun he held became an extension of his body, every shot a lesson in timing, accuracy, and precision. The boy spent countless hours practicing in the wilderness, hidden from any prying eyes. He carved targets from wood and set them in open fields, sometimes hundreds of feet away, perfecting his aim with patience that would make a saint envious. Rain, sun, and wind became his teachers. A sudden gust of wind taught him to adjust his aim. The sway of a branch taught him to anticipate movement, and the sound of a distant bird helped him gauge auditory cues. By the time he reached his late teens, he had become more than competent. He had become deadly accurate, capable of hitting a target at distances that even seasoned men struggled with. But skill alone was not enough. The boy quickly realized that survival on the frontier required understanding psychology as much as marksmanship. He observed how fear worked, how the smallest hesitation in a man's eyes could give away his intentions. He learned to approach confrontations calmly, to appear unthreatening until the moment he needed to strike. In duels, he discovered that the perception of speed mattered as much as actual speed. A steady gaze, a slight twitch of the hand, a confident stance could intimidate opponents before a single shot was fired. He combined patience, observation, and mechanical skill into a lethal package. Word of his ability began to spread, though initially only in whispers among the local settlements. Farmers and traders would tell stories of a young man who could draw faster than any adult, whose aim was so true that a coin tossed into the air could be shot in half before it touched the ground. But these rumors were only partial truths. Few knew the full story, that this boy had been forged by years of cruelty, observation, and survival instincts honed under the harshest conditions imaginable. He was not just a gunslinger, he was a product of calculated preparation, instinctive intelligence, and relentless practice. Encounters with other gunslingers became his proving ground. When he faced older, more experienced men in duels or confrontations, he used strategy as much as skill. He learned to read the slight shifts in weight, the subtle flex of a finger on a trigger, the flicker in an opponent's eyes. Each confrontation was a battle of minds as much as of weapons. And time and again, he emerged victorious, not through brute force alone, but through anticipation, speed, and an almost preternatural ability to predict the actions of his enemies. But the boy's reputation did not develop through duels alone. Survival in the wild required him to take risks to hunt, to defend himself, and at times, to protect those who could not protect themselves. He became known as a figure who could walk into a tense situation and emerge unscathed, a man who could outdraw, outthink, and outmaneuver any opponent. His presence alone commanded attention. His reputation spread faster than word of mouth, because those who faced him and survived to tell the tale carried the memory of his skill like a mark burned into their consciousness. Even in towns where he was unknown, the legend of a young gunslinger began to circulate. Stories of a mysterious boy who could shoot with uncanny accuracy, who never seemed to panic, and who appeared at precisely the right moment to win a fight became the stuff of local lore. By the time he reached his late teens, he was no longer just a runaway slave. He had become a figure of fear and respect, a young man whose mastery of firearms would cement his place as one of the deadliest gunslingers the frontier had ever seen. It was a transformation that few could comprehend. A child born into slavery, who had endured unimaginable suffering, had taken the skills he had learned in secrecy and forged them into a weapon that allowed him not only to survive, but to dominate in a world where death was always close at hand. In the wilderness of Texas, the boy had become a force of nature, blending the lessons of observation, patience, and relentless practice into something that could not be matched, a gunslinger who was feared as much for his mind as for his aim. As the boy's reputation spread across the Texas frontier, it was inevitable that he would be tested in real confrontations, and these duels became the defining moments that cemented his place as a legend. Unlike staged competitions or friendly demonstrations, the duels he faced were matters of survival, often fueled by grudges, disputes over land, or the reckless bravado of men who underestimated him. Each encounter was a test, not only of his skill with firearms, but also of his patience, his nerves, and the ability to read human behavior under pressure. In many ways, these duels were his proving ground, where the boy's training and instincts were sharpened to their finest edge. One of the first recorded duels occurred in a small settlement near the Red River. A local gunslinger, already infamous for his speed and accuracy, challenged the young newcomer after hearing whispers of his growing reputation. The challenge was simple: a straight, draw duel at high noon in the middle of the dusty street. But the boy had learned early that duels were never truly simple. He studied his opponent carefully, noting the slight twitch in his right eye, the way his hand hovered near the holster, and the rhythm of his breathing. In the heat of the sun, with townspeople watching from windows and doorways, he waited for the exact instant his opponent's trigger finger moved. In a flash, the shot rang out, the older gunslinger hit the ground, and the crowd barely had time to exhale. That duel became the first of many that would define him. Another confrontation took place near a trading post, where two rival factions of cattle drivers had come to blows over disputed land. The boy was caught in the middle of a tense standoff. Armed men surrounded him, ready to test the young gunslinger, whose name had already begun to instill fear. He didn't panic. Instead, he used his environment to his advantage. With precise timing and a steady hand, he disarmed one man before the others could react. The duel ended without unnecessary bloodshed, but it left everyone present with the unmistakable impression that this boy was more than a skilled marksman. He was a strategist, capable of thinking several steps ahead even in the midst of chaos. Perhaps the most infamous of his confrontations occurred at a settlement outside San Antonio, where a notorious outlaw gang had been terrorizing locals. The gang had heard of the boy and decided to test his skill for themselves. Armed and outnumbered, they cornered him in a narrow alley at sunset. The young gunslinger faced certain death. Yet he remained calm, drawing on every lesson learned from years of survival. Using a combination of agility, misdirection, and precise shooting, he neutralized the threat one by one. By the time the last man fell to the ground, the boy had already vanished into the surrounding fields, leaving behind only astonished witnesses who would recount the story for decades. In these duels, he learned the importance of psychological advantage. He discovered that fear could be as powerful a weapon as any gun. A steady gaze, a slight movement of the body, or even an intimidating stare could unnerve opponents before a shot was fired. He often used his youth and small stature to mislead adversaries, making them underestimate his ability, a fatal mistake for anyone who faced him. Over time, people began to approach duels with caution, knowing that the boy's reputation was not just a tale, but a warning. To challenge him was to risk death. The boy's dueling style was precise, methodical, and coldly efficient. Unlike others who relied purely on speed or brute force, he combined timing, accuracy, and strategy. He could anticipate his opponent's movements, read subtle cues, and act decisively at the perfect moment. Each duel strengthened his skills further, teaching him lessons that books could not offer: patience under pressure, the power of observation, and the art of controlling a fight before it even began. These confrontations also shaped his legend outside Texas. Travelers, traders, and other gunslingers carried stories of the boy who had risen from slavery to confront the deadliest men on the frontier and survive. His name became synonymous with skill and fearlessness. Those who had witnessed his duels spoke of him in hushed tones, describing a young man whose hands were steady, whose eyes were sharp, and whose movements were almost preternatural. He had become a symbol of both survival and unstoppable force, a boy who had taken the cruelties of his past and transformed them into mastery over life and death in a violent, lawless land. But even as his reputation grew, so did the danger. Every duel, every confrontation drew attention from men who wanted to test him, exploit him, or end him. The boy quickly realized that to survive, he could not rely solely on skill with firearms. He had to be cunning, strategic, and unpredictable. Every duel taught him something new, not just about guns, but about human nature, fear, and the delicate balance between life and death. By the end of this period, the boy was no longer just a runaway slave or a frontier youth. He had become a living legend, a figure whose presence inspired awe and terror in equal measure. Tales of his duels were whispered in saloons, around campfires, and along dusty trails. His skill was unmatched, his precision nearly supernatural, and his ability to survive impossible odds made him an unstoppable force. The duels were more than tests of ability. They were the crucible in which a legend was forged, and every man who faced him would remember it for the rest of his life. What truly set the boy apart from every other gunslinger on the Texas frontier wasn't just his speed or accuracy, it was his mind. From a young age, he had been trained in observation and patience, skills honed in the cruelest environment imaginable. On the plantation, survival depended not just on strength, but on noticing the smallest details, reading subtle shifts in expression, predicting movement, and understanding when to act or remain hidden. When he escaped into the vast and lawless wilderness of Texas, he transformed those survival instincts into a form of deadly strategy that would make him nearly impossible to defeat. He learned that every confrontation, whether with a man or a gang, was more than a simple duel, it was a chess game. He studied the terrain, using the landscape to his advantage. Hills, trees, fences, and even shadows became tools in his arsenal. He could anticipate the path of a pursuer and set traps using nothing more than rope, wood, or clever positioning. If he faced a street standoff in a small frontier town, he would arrive early, memorizing escape routes, noting hidden corners, and planning where he could move to maximize his advantage. His opponents often believed they were the ones in control, only to find themselves outmaneuvered at the exact moment they made a move. Timing became his greatest weapon. He knew when to wait, when to act, and when to withdraw. He understood that fear could be manipulated, that hesitation in an opponent could be exploited, and that a single well-timed action could end a conflict before it began. He rarely fired without purpose. Every shot was calculated, deliberate, and precise. In duels, he often drew the attention of his opponent, feigning uncertainty or distraction. And then, struck with flawless timing, men who thought they were quicker or stronger would find themselves disarmed, wounded, or forced to surrender, often without realizing how carefully they had been played. Observation, however, was not just about reading people. He was also a student of human nature, learning to anticipate reactions, predict intentions, and exploit weaknesses. He recognized arrogance, impatience, fear, and greed, traits that he could use to his advantage. A boastful outlaw might make a move too soon, thinking himself superior. A cautious sheriff might hesitate, unsure of the boy's skill. In every scenario, the boy's ability to analyze the situation before acting gave him the edge. His mind turned every encounter into a puzzle, every opponent into a set of variables to manipulate. Intelligence and adaptability became his trademarks. He learned to improvise in moments of crisis, creating opportunities from chaos. If a gun jammed, he could disarm or intimidate his opponent through bluff or movement. If outnumbered, he would isolate enemies one by one, striking in unexpected ways that left even seasoned fighters unnerved. No matter the circumstance, he maintained calm, patience, and clarity, qualities rarely seen in gunslingers driven purely by aggression or instinct. Those who faced him quickly realized that he was not just fast with a trigger, he was calculating, analytical, and terrifyingly effective. The boy also understood that reputation itself was a tool. Stories of his unmatched speed, deadly accuracy, and clever tactics spread faster than he ever could travel. Fear preceded him, giving him leverage even before he faced his opponents. Men would hesitate, second, guess themselves, or retreat entirely, knowing that challenging him was almost always a mistake. In the dangerous, unpredictable frontier, this psychological advantage often meant the difference between life and death, and it saved him more times than any gun ever could. Even when facing larger groups or gangs, he relied on strategy rather than brute force. He preferred to divide and conquer, creating scenarios where enemies turned on one another or made mistakes under pressure. Every engagement became a study in control, controlling the environment, controlling the timing, and controlling the minds of those around him. Unlike other gunslingers, who relied solely on reflexes or reputation, he combined intellect, instinct, and skill into a perfect storm that few could survive. This blend of strategy, intelligence, and tactics made him nearly untouchable. Across the Texas frontier, stories circulated of a young man who could escape ambushes, win duels against the deadliest gunslingers, and survive impossible odds, all while remaining one step ahead of everyone else. He became more than a legend. He became a symbol of cunning, precision, and the extraordinary results of turning oppression and hardship into skill and power. By mastering not just the mechanics of shooting, but the psychology of confrontation and the art of strategy, the boy transformed himself from a fugitive into an unstoppable force. He proved that survival on the frontier wasn't about brute strength alone. It was about thinking faster, acting smarter, and exploiting every advantage the world and human nature could offer. In the end, it was not just his aim or his speed that made him the deadliest gunslinger, but the mind behind the gun, a mind shaped by slavery, honed by necessity, and perfected in the unforgiving wilds of Texas. By the time the boy, now a young man, had fully established his reputation across Texas, he had become more than a gunslinger. He had transformed into a living legend, a symbol of defiance, skill, and survival that would echo long after the dust settled on the frontier. His story was not written in books or newspapers at first, but in whispered tales around campfires, in saloons where cowboys exchanged news, and on the lips of settlers who had witnessed his impossible feats. The young man who had once been a frightened, enslaved child had become a name that inspired awe and fear in equal measure, a legend whose shadow stretched far beyond any single duel or confrontation. His legacy was built on the combination of skill, cunning, and relentless determination. People told stories of how he could appear at the precise moment to settle a dispute, how he could disarm multiple opponents with nothing but his wits and a single revolver, and how his calm, calculated demeanor made him almost untouchable. His presence alone could shift the balance in any standoff, and the memory of his unmatched dueling victories created a reputation that preceded him. Those who had heard his name often treated it as a warning, not of arrogance, but of respect for a force that had defied death, hardship, and the lawless chaos of the frontier. More than his feats, the boy's life symbolized survival against impossible odds. He had escaped the bonds of slavery, faced extreme danger, and mastered a violent, unforgiving world while remaining true to himself. For many, he became a symbol of hope and possibility, proof that even a child born into oppression could rise to become a figure of immense influence and power. Tales of his escape and rise spread not only among frontier communities, but also across generations, whispered to children and preserved in oral histories. His story represented resilience, intelligence, and the relentless pursuit of freedom, serving as an example for anyone who had ever been told they were powerless. The boy also left a legacy in the way he approached conflict. Unlike others who relied solely on violence, he combined strategy, intelligence, and psychological mastery. This approach not only kept him alive in countless dangerous encounters, but also reshaped the way people thought about survival on the frontier. His name became synonymous not just with guns or duels, but with cunning, foresight, and the ability to outthink opponents in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Those who tried to emulate him learned that skill alone was not enough. Victory required observation, patience, and the understanding of human behavior. Over time, the legend of the gunslinger became larger than life. Stories of his exploits, some verified, some undoubtedly exaggerated, traveled from town to town. He was said to have survived impossible ambushes, outdrawn the fastest men in Texas, and navigated the most dangerous situations with a combination of courage and intellect that few could comprehend. His actions inspired fear in his enemies, admiration in witnesses, and respect among those who recognized the sheer magnitude of what he had accomplished. Each story reinforced the mythos of a young man who had turned every lesson of hardship into a weapon, every scar into a mark of mastery. But his legacy was not only about fear or legend. It was also about transformation of himself, of the people who knew of him, and of the frontier itself. He embodied the idea that intelligence, skill, and courage could overcome circumstances that seemed insurmountable. In a world ruled by brute force and violence, he demonstrated that survival required something more: strategy, awareness, and adaptability. His life became a blueprint for navigating a world filled with danger, proving that those who were underestimated could rise to unimaginable heights. Even decades later, the stories persisted. Travelers passing through Texas would hear tales of a young gunslinger who had emerged from slavery to dominate the frontier, whose name was spoken in hushed tones by those who feared to challenge him. Folklore blended with reality, turning him into a mythic figure, a symbol of what one could achieve through skill, courage, and the refusal to be broken by circumstance. His legend served as both warning and inspiration, a warning to those who underestimated him, and inspiration to those who sought freedom and mastery in a world that offered little mercy. Ultimately, the boy who had escaped slavery and become the deadliest gunslinger left a legacy that went far beyond duels or notoriety. He became an enduring figure in the history of Texas, a testament to resilience, intelligence, and the relentless pursuit of self-determination. His story proved that even in a world defined by violence and oppression, one individual could rise, survive, and leave a mark that time could never erase. The frontier remembered him, the towns remembered him, and history, both whispered and recorded, would never forget the young man who turned hardship into legend and survival into art.